First of all, I want to say thank you for the invitation. I want to apologize because I am I'm having problems here with the connection. Um, I'm trying to, to come up with a solution, but it didn't work. I just don't want to risk having, being on the air and not being able to transmit my lecture. So I decided to record it, to send you the recording in a link so that you present it there to the audience, and then I can come up in the questions and answer if needed. Okay. So first of all, I want to thanks for the invitation and the organization of this event. The work of Sabelo and Ndlovu-Gatsheni is a seminal work for African studies, definitely. And of course, what brings us today is the book written by Toyin Falola on Sabelo's work. The title is Sabelo, Ndlovu-Gatsheni and African Decolonial Studies. So basically, I would like to comment on some of the issues. I think that this book brings an excellent summary, although there are parts that could be polemical, but I think it brings an excellent portrait of the work of Sabelo, and also talks about some of the conditional possibility of the theory Sabelo is producing. I want to go deeper into this question because I think many times I think there's a shared preoccupation or a shared concern among decolonial thinkers from the global south that I think points to similar issues. And this is what I would like to discuss or go deeper into, because I find some of the points made in this book are useful, and I think we should look at it in a more, we should discuss it more overtly. One of the things that this book, brings in is precisely the biographical history of Sabelo and the concerns that came out of that history. And I would like to begin with the question about the disenchantment with nationalism. The disenchantment with nationalism. I think that nationalism in many parts of the third world attempted to bring a solution to colonialism by basically emphasizing on the political independence of the country. Okay, like liberation was equivalent to breaking with the colonial administration, destroying the colonial administration, and organizing a state, a political independent state. And that was the idea or the ideal of most anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movements in the third world. I kind of feel that there is an overlapping between this discontent with nationalism and the production of decolonial theories, or the attempt at going deeper into decoloniality. One of the things that comes, very obvious in the work of Sabelo is his experience in Zimbabwe, and I'm kind of, I cannot deny that I'm kind of projecting myself also in this thing. There's no way I can talk as if I'm talking from nowhere or from no space or from a neutral position, because in fact, reading this book made me think about the geopolitics and body politics of knowledge of Sabelo. And you know, um, his contribution to colonial studies. I mean, today I would say Sabelo is not only, the #1 decolonial scholar and thinker in Africa, but I would say he's among the top decolonial thinkers in the world. When I met Sabelo, I mean, years ago, we began having an exchange of basically emails where he asked me to send him material to read on decoloniality. That was, I don't know, a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago. And I remember sending him every 2-3 months material. And I was surprised because every 2 months, every 3 months, he would write me back and say, okay, I already read this. If you have more, please send it to me. Until finally, after a few years of exchange of material and things like this, I invited him with his students to come to the Barcelona Decolonial School. And I told him, hey, why don't you come and just, we can meet and you can get exposed to some of the decolonial thinkers who are invited here. And I have to say that I'm impressed by how prolific Sabelo is in terms of his intellectual production. Okay, so I want to first recognize that. But apart from that thing, that acknowledgement, which I think is a consensus among all of us participating in this event, I think I want to explore more this geopolitical knowledge, the experience or the disenchantment with the experience of political independence, okay, in the third world, in the periphery of the world economy. And especially the problems with anti-colonialism, nationalism, as a response or a solution to colonial administrations, and as a way to build a state that is politically independent from empires. And here comes the disenchantment, because there are many layers. We want to understand the world Sabelo that is very well described here. We need to, in a sense, understand where is Sabelo coming from. And here I identify completely with him because I went through something similar in the Caribbean and Latin America. In the sense that first, how we inherited nationalism, in a sense, was anti-colonial, but was not decolonial. Okay, this is very important for the world we live today. That is, today, even though colonial administrations are over from most of the world, okay, we're still living under the domination of colonial relations and of coloniality, of power, of knowledge, coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of being. Because in many ways, we have colonial independences. But this sounds like a paradox. We have both in Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, most of the world, we have what Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism. But to be more precise about what does neocolonialism mean, it's not just that you've been dominated after independence by new forms of colonialism in the sense of being exploited by a metropole the way you were exploited during colonialism. That is, there was an economic imperialist domination or core periphery domination with the newly independent countries. It's not only that. It's that we inherited a westernization of political structures and epistemic structure. That is, nationalism, the way it's theorized by Sabelo, which overlaps in many ways to the way we theorize it also in Latin America. But of course, when we talk about Africa, we're talking also about it has a different history than Latin America, of course. But in many ways, there's some overlapping there in the sense that nationalism, anti-colonialism plus nationalism was really a continuation. The continuities from colonialism were stronger than the discontinuities because nationalism provided, by inheriting westernization of political structure and epistemic structures, it naturally reproduced many of the Eurocentric structures, okay, of domination that were, in a sense, useful for the subordination of the newly independent country to a metropolitan Western power, okay? And for example, the question about inheritance of, westernization of political structure, just to give an example, the nation state. The nation state as a form of political structure, that was imitated by national liberation movement who were anti-colonial, were nationalists, but they were not decolonial. They were still reproducing epistemic structure of Eurocentrism. And therefore, when it came to solutions, they just brought into our countries structures of knowledge, but also structures of political structures of organization that were coming from Europe and were very, in a sense, very problematic and disconnected from the realities of our countries. Just as an example, we can see how in Africa, for example, the concept of nation state is very problematic because, in a sense, the imperial powers during colonial time, they just split the territories arbitrarily. They put borders in an arbitrary way, and then created structures of this pretension of a nation state, one state with one identity that corresponds one-to-one with the identity of the population within the boundaries of that state. That's a very problematic concept because that's a fiction. It doesn't exist anywhere. And if you think about how these borders were divided and split among imperialist countries in Africa, you could see that the divisions were very arbitrary. So one of the things that happened is that you have not one or two or three ethnic groups or, inside one state, is that you have 15, 20. And usually what happened is that during the period of independence, one of those groups or two became the dominant ethno-national group in the country, and then exercise a colonial power over the other groups that have no access to the power of the nation state, that are excluded from the nation state. And so, and part of the exclusion is about building identities that will fit some groups and exclude others, and so this inheritance of the concept of nation state in situations that were already polluted by imperial colonial drawing of borders that did not take into account the different ethnicities and groups within languages, people, etc., inside those territories, created a situation where the whole thing was, the whole project of building an independent nation state was leading to failure because we are, in a sense, inheriting a structure, a political structure that is very much an imitation of European, especially French Revolution, French state structures that were totally unrealistic to the realities on the ground of the countries in Africa, Latin America, and many places. So that's one thing that that you could see in the world of Sabelo, especially in Zimbabwe, and the nationalist movement led by Mugabe. How they were, in a sense, reproducing colonial structures of domination inside the state, after independence, and excluding different groups that did not fit the hegemonic, let's say, ethnic group or tribal group or whatever that was, in a sense, taking over the structures of the nation state. And then all these other groups that did not fit the hegemonic identity were excluded, were just oppressed inside this newly independent country. So you have like a colonial power reproduced inside the newly independent countries that was, in a sense, reproducing colonial structures of domination, okay, but now with a local group in particular, becoming the new the new hegemonic group inside this new structure called the nation state. And so you could see in the work of Sabelo an effort to try to come up with a way to decolonize from this type of inherited political structures of domination that are basically coming from a Eurocentric epistemology of the nationalist movements that will be reproducing again, everything we're fighting against. That's why the concept of colonial independences or independences without decolonization is a very useful concept that we use in Latin America, because it could be, in a sense, applied to other places, because what happened was that we achieved independences that did not decolonize a lot of the hierarchies among different ethnic groups. We did not decolonize our epistemologies and so on. And so when we open our eyes, we were now independent from a metropolitan center, but in fact, we were just reproducing again everything we're fighting against, because we were, in a sense, colonized by epistemologically and by the way we imagine forms of political authority. We were importing forms of political authority from the West. We were not taking into consideration traditional knowledges, traditional structures of that provide alternative way of thinking about political authority and so on, that were more realistic on the ground to the realities of Africa or Latin America, than these imported theories coming from the West. And so, so I think that, in a sense, one of the, this is one thing that I think is at the center of the geopolitics of knowledge. From where is Sabelo thinking from? He's thinking from these realities of disenchantment with the project of decolonization, with nationalism, and how, because when you haven't decolonized in terms of epistemic structure or political structure, what ended up happening is that also we become subordinated economically. That is, we did not decolonize the international division of labor. We're still in the periphery after independence. There was no decolonization of the location and the economic structures in the countries that became independent. So in a sense, we were formally independent, but in reality, we were in a, like Kwame Nkrumah will characterize, we were in a neocolonial situation. And meaning by that there are new forms of colonialism. That is, instead of having a colonial administration, now formally, the countries in the third world are formally independent, but in reality, they're not. They're still dominated economically by a metropolitan imperialist country. Many times the old imperial power, where the same ones now dominating after independence, the economy of the country. The people were exploited, the resources were taken away, the wealth of the country were going towards the same metropolitan powers that were colonially dominating the countries. But now, after independence, it just continued. And part of the weaknesses of this project of independence is that we had, in a sense, the reproduction of westernized political structures and epistemic structures that basically did not lead to a decolonization of the coloniality of power and coloniality of being and coloniality of knowledge. We just reproduce the same things or the same structures that the West will be exporting elsewhere, that in a sense were just leading our countries to not advance in the process of decolonization. So you have like independences without decolonization. If you become independent, but you do not decolonize from the epistemology, the Eurocentric epistemology. Your imagination, your knowledge structure are just going to reproduce the questions and answers and solutions of the West, not your question, not your problem, not the situation of your country. So you're importing theories that have nothing to do with the realities on the ground of the countries that just became independent. And you're going on top of the import westernized political structure. You're going to imitate the West also in the way the West organized states and political authority and all of this. We're just reproducing once again a colonial power that is going to elevate one group, one ethnic group, to the position of being the hegemonic group in a country, and you're going to exclude the rest of the groups that have a different identity and come from a different history within the same borders of that state, you know. And in Latin America, we have, in a sense, indigenous movements came up with a way to think about a structure beyond the nation state, which is the plurinational state. That happened in Ecuador, that happened in Bolivia. They changed the constitution, and they came with a constitution now that is looking at this, is critical of the concept of nation state, because that's a fiction that doesn't exist anywhere. This pretension of one state with one identity that corresponds one-to-one with the identity of the population, that doesn't exist anywhere. And indigenous people in Latin America, who've been the victim of the coloniality of power of nation states, okay, of that form of political authority, they develop, the movements push for a constitutional transformation into what is known as plurinational state, the recognition that we're several nations coexisting inside one state, and then bringing a juridical system, a plural juridical system, and interculturality to be able to live together. But to live together, understanding that we are different nations with different epistemologies, cosmology, different forms of being, and that there has to be some way to intercultural way to live together respecting the differences. So equality, the concept of equality was resignified, understanding not in the French Revolution type of an abstract, okay, an abstract concept, but, you know, of equality, but equality understood, okay, we are in Spanish is somos iguales porque somos diferentes. We are equal because we are different, okay? So if you try to make me transform my culture, my ways of being, you know, my ways of living, my cultural practices, my language, everything to become like the West, then this concept of equality is really problematic. It's a form of colonization in the name of equality. In reality, there's no respect for the differences among different nations inside that state. It's one nation imposing on the other the concept of the cultural, you know, assimilating the other into the same. And that's a form of colonization. So indigenous people are saying, okay, first, we could be equal only when you recognize, but everybody recognizes that we're different nations living together and coexisting inside one state. And then from there, from that recognition, without one trying to colonize the other or assimilate the other into the same, from that space of respect to the differences, then you can build a project of equality where now you can distribute resources, you can now, of the state, you can now look at the different, the school system, health system, and so on, in a plurinational way, in a pluri-epistemological way, where now the different people coexisting inside that state will have access to similar resources, but the institutions of schooling or of health or other things are not going to be necessarily the same, because each different group have different cosmology, different epistemologies, and will be having different ways of thinking about pedagogy, content of schools, language, and so on, okay? And so this is something that that in Latin America you could see in Bolivia and Ecuador. Now, part of this disenchantment have to do with the contemporary situation in Africa, Latin America, other places. But talking about Africa, we know that the problem of the multiplicity of ethnic groups inside one state that pretend to have the fiction of a nation state, it just leads to, you have led to civil wars, to all kind of violence, because there is always this challenge about who is defining the policies of the nation state and which group will monopolize or take over the resources of the nation state. So there is a dispute in society the moment the structure is built along those lines of nation state of who is going to be the one who defines the nation. And if you have different, 15 different ethnic groups with different culture, different language, different tradition, etc., and you have only one that takes over the state and impose on the others their policies, then we are now reproducing again a coloniality of power at the level of the state, okay? And so, and so therefore, the effort of Sabelo has been to think carefully about epistemic structures. When he talks about epistemic freedom, in a way, it's a liberation from those epistemic structures that have been inherited from colonialism that are Eurocentric and do not allow us to think for ourselves what are the questions and what are the solutions, okay? We are importing questions that are not our questions, are the questions of the West. And then once we are colonized along the line of the questions, then there's no way out of giving colonial responses to the questions. The questions frame the answers. If you are importing questions that are not the question of the realities of the country, you're going to necessarily, inherently give Eurocentric responses. And I think this is, in a sense, at the heart, I think, of the project of Sabelo, is precisely thinking from realities and producing knowledge that will break away from the inheritance of epistemological structures of domination that do not allow us to move beyond, okay? And so, so in a sense, Sabelo has been, I would say, a master of something that in the colonial perspective, we've been insisting, different authors, is that decoloniality is a double move. Decoloniality has is always decolonizing from the outer structures of the system, but it's also decolonizing from the inner structures. That is decolonizing. So we need to go in both directions. Decolonizing from the coloniality of power, okay, the outer structures of the system, the structures of domination, West over the rest, in terms of the political economy of the world, the global system, capitalism, as well as modernity, but also, the structures of such as racism, racial hierarchies, epistemic hierarchies, and so on. I mean, there are institutions enforcing this that become outer structures of the system that are at the heart of the neocolonial structures that we live in the periphery today. That today we went from colonial administration to now neocolonial structures of domination. So, so this is where I see the effort of Sabelo thinking in both directions. Inner structure, meaning the structures of knowledge, the epistemic structure that we have inherited and we have internalized, at the same time that we're looking at liberating from outer structures. But both things have to go together, because if you only dedicate yourself to to decolonize from inner structure and do not deal with outer structure, with injustices of the system, then you kind of become new age, no? You're just decolonizing your heart and you internally, but you're not really decolonizing. You're leaving the world intact. You're not changing the world. The other extreme is thinking that just by changing outer structures, then people automatically or mechanically change inner structures, our minds, our hearts, our ways of thinking, and so on. No, that's a mechanical, I would say that's like mechanical vision, as if human beings are kind of machines, and if you change the outer structure, they immediately change the culture, the knowledge, etc. And that doesn't go automatically like that. And then I always say you are only looking at changing outer structure and do not deal with the inner structure, then you became a mechanical reductionist Marxist, you know? And so this is these are two streams that I think in decoloniality we try to avoid, because we understand that both structures, the decolonization of inner structure, decolonization of outer structures, are fundamental, are necessary for the liberation, the project of liberation of our people in the global south. And I see the work of Sabelo, you know, very strongly addressing both structures, you know, and seeing the dialectics and the connection between the two, you know, that these things are not separate, they are entangled, okay? And the question of double coloniality, like we are fighting, we're fighting the domination, the external domination of imperial structure, metropolitan centers, of domination, exploitation of our countries in the era of neocolonialism. But at the same time, we reproduce inside our own countries the structures of domination of colonial times, but through the ways I explained already of reproducing, for example, concept of political authority such as the nation state, or reproducing epistemic structure, Eurocentric epistemic structure, and we just come and build again, you know, a colonial structural domination inside our countries that are entangled with the domination from outside our country. So there is a double coloniality exercise there. The coloniality vis-a-vis the Western imperialist domination and exploitation of the global south, but at the same time, the coloniality reproduced now with the newly independent elites of the third world, reproducing again a coloniality inside the nation state, including racial hierarchies, dehumanization of some groups, hyperhumanization of others. So the question about racism is also central in the work of Sabelo, because in a sense, as a good decolonial scholar, we cannot think of liberation, you know, or Africa's liberation without, you know, thinking about how to emancipate or how to decolonize from racial hierarchies, where African people are being dehumanized vis-a-vis, in this case, Western people becoming hyperhumanized or becoming the superior race or becoming, you know, over, and then the people from the global south, in this case, Africans, becoming dehumanized. So this question of dehumanization is also at the center of the work of Sabelo about how to rehumanize Africans, okay? Coming from a history of Western modernity, Western capitalist modernity, where racism is an organizing principle of the political economy of capitalism, how capitalism is entangled with racial hierarchy. This is a central question for Sabelo too, that is addressing in this whole in his theory about decolonization, you know. And so I see in the book that the book is addressing, you know, these different issues of his work in an excellent way. However, I think that it's important to see there, or to emphasize the question about what are in a sense, the geopolitical knowledge or the meta structural context that is if you want to call it the metaphysics or the geopolitical knowledge that is behind the theory produced by Sabelo. And I think it's at the center of this question of dehumanization, questions of the inheritance of colonial knowledge in nationalism and in the post-independence period, where we have the reproduction against of the same thing we're fighting against during colonial time, now being reproduced once again inside the nation states, and the question about decolonization of the economy, the politics, and knowledge structures, and so and of course the question about Marxism and decolonization. I think Sabelo has been at the center of rescuing African Marxists, okay? People who are thinking Marxism from a non-Eurocentric gaze and that have been thinking about the realities of Africa, or thinking from Africa, and of course modifying Marxist theory. And so you could see this in Black Marxists, both Africans, Caribbean, and North Americans, that they're always looking at how race is not superstructure, how race is always, in a sense, a constitutive of capital's accumulation. It's not a derivative of capital accumulation, but it's an organizing principle of capital's accumulation. Anyway, I want to maybe stop here to maybe open for discussion. I just wanted to emphasize, those aspects of the work of Sabelo that I think are that we need to make visible about what are the concerns where Sabelo is thinking from. And I kind of identify myself, I project myself a lot, maybe this is a psychological thing. I look in Sabelo, someone that is engaging with the same problems I'm engaging, for example, in the Caribbean and Latin America. And this is something that I think we should stress to be able to then understand why Sabelo doing what he's doing, okay? Where are these theories coming from? Why is it giving this kind of responses to the challenges of our times?